Hello everyone, it's another day that we continue to learn and have fun with Excel. In our last video, which is the Excel Basics video number 6, we got to learn the Excel table feature and we compared the three types of formulas. The Excel table feature, the dynamic spilled array formulas, and the traditional formulas, as I call them, which is the single input, single output formulas. In this video, we will get to learn pivot tables and how to create pivot tables and slices. The topics that we'll cover in this video are listed right here. Now you may ask, why a pivot table? And I will tell you, a pivot table is one of the most useful and powerful Excel tools to calculate, summarize, and analyze data that lets you see the comparisons, the patterns, and trends in your data. The pivot table does not change the data in your spreadsheet, but you use this as a tool to summarize your data to obtain a desired report. So pivot means it turns. Thus, we pivot the data and we view it in our desired and different perspectives. Now we know that we use Excel to store raw data and we convert that data into useful information. Now with the pivot tables, we are converting that raw data into useful information, and this useful information will enable the organization or the company to make informed decisions based on the summarized data. Now let's get started with the fun of seeing how the pivot table works and it summarizes the raw data. And I will go to Standard PivotTable worksheet. So if you're following me, please click on the Standard PivotTable worksheet. Before we create a pivot table, let's first of all look at the pivot table fields task pane. This is the pivot table fields task pane. The fields that you see here are the fields in your table. And that is why it is important to have a proper data set with field names in the first row, as this is what we'll show here. These are the field names in our table right here. And you can see right here, the field names are on the first row of our table. You can have more than one table that you're creating pivot tables for, but in this video, we will only cover how to create pivot tables with the one table. And in our upcoming videos, we will see how we can create pivot tables using multiple tables or more than one table. A pivot table includes these primary areas. The filter areas, it contains a filter button. You can see the filter button right there. The filter button limits the pivot table to only those values matching the specified criteria or the specified condition. The columns area displays the category from one or more fields arranged in separate columns. So if we drag the field in the columns area, it will display the field arranged in a separate column. The rows area displays the category of values from one or more fields arranged in separate rows. Same thing, any field that we drag here in the rows area, it will be arranged in separate rows. The values area is to summarize the statistics for one or more values at each intersection of the row and the column category. For example, any field that we drag here, if it's a text field, it will default in count. If we drag a number field here, it will default in sum. But we do have an option to change to the calculation that we would like to summarize that field as. For example, we can add, that is sum, we can count, we can calculate the average, and many more that we will see in this video. In our pivot table example 1, we will create pivot tables, or we will summarize our table here, which as you can see, it's a proper data set. It has field names at the top of our table. It has records on each row, and we have empty cells all around our data or around our table. When creating a pivot table, you must always leave empty cells around your table or around your data sets. Never have any data touching your table, as this will mess your pivot table. And let me show you what I mean by that. I will delete this column, right click, delete. And now if I were to insert a pivot table, let me show you quickly how this messes your data. You can see I'm inserting a pivot table from table or range, but you can see it's selecting even the data that I don't want to be included in our pivot table. So never have any data touching your data set or touching the table that you're using to create a pivot table. I will cancel that and I will Control Z to undo that. Now let's create a pivot table. To insert a pivot table, there's different ways that you can do that, and I have provided that in our class notes. You can use a keyboard shortcut, and the keyboard shortcut is Alt and VT if your data is coming from a table or a range. You use Alt and VD if your data is coming from a data model, and we will see that in our upcoming videos. Now, the other way to insert a pivot table is to click the Insert tab on your ribbon. And on the Insert tab, you can see the Pivot Table button right there. You click on that Pivot Table button, and you can see you have options to choose your data from. So if your data is coming from a table or range, which is our data right here, then we select the first option. And the keyboard shortcut, as I said, is Alt and VT for the table. If your data is coming from a data model, which right here you can see it's grayed out because I don't have any data model in this workbook, then you will do Alt and VD. You can see you also have options to get data from an external source. And you also see you have an option to get data from Power BI. So with this option, your organization will show here. For me, it's showing Highline College. In this video, we're learning how to create standard pivot tables. We do have two different types of pivot tables that we will learn in this class. But first, in this video, we're learning how to create standard pivot tables. A standard pivot table stores data in a PivotTable cache. And we can use a standard pivot table for a table that has about 50,000 rows or less. And or if we want to summarize our data with simple calculations, such as summarize values by or show values as, and we will learn that in this class. With the data model pivot tables, it stores data in the Power Pivot Data Model columnar database. This is the best option when you have a large amount of data and you have multiple related tables, or you want to make calculations that a standard pivot table cannot easily make. Now we will insert our first pivot table in our pivot table example 1 here. The first thing that you need to make sure is that you click in one cell in the proper dataset. If you're using the Insert tab on your ribbon, then make sure you select the Insert tab and then click the Pivot Table button and then select from Table Range. And that will open for you the Pivot Table from Table or Range dialog box. I will cancel that. Now, I hardly use that option. I like using the keyboard shortcut, and that is what I will use in this class. If you like using the Insert option and then select the Pivot Table button, that is fine. But if you would get used to using the keyboard shortcut, that will be quicker and easier. And that's what I will do in these videos. So to create or to insert a pivot table, I'm making sure that I am in one cell in the proper dataset. I do not have to select all the cells. I also don't have to be in a cell outside the proper dataset. I need to be inside in one cell in the proper dataset. And then I will use my keyboard shortcut, Alt and VT. My data is coming from a table or range, and that's why I used Alt and VT. Now that opens for me the pivot table from range or table dialog box. The first thing that you need to make sure when this opens is that you see your table range is selected here, and you can see it's locked and the name of the worksheet is also listed there. The next thing that you need to make sure that you do is to choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. So by default, if you click OK, it's placed in a new worksheet. If you would like to place it in an existing worksheet, you need to make sure that you select existing worksheet. And once you do that, it gives you an option to select the location, and you can see my cursor is in the location box right here. So the next thing that I will need to do is to click on a cell where I would like my pivot table to be. So I will click there, and once I do that, you can see the name of the worksheet here and the name of the cell that I selected. Now you will choose whether you want to analyze multiple tables. So you will add the data to the data model. For us, we are not adding this data to the data model, so we are not checking this box. And again, as I said, we will see the data model in our later videos. So for now, we're just creating a standard pivot table. So the next thing that I need to do is to click OK. And now once I do that, you can see it opens the pivot table fields task pane. I have the list of the fields that are in our data set or in our table. And we can see now we have the field areas where we can drag these fields to the different areas that we want to drag into here. So the next thing that we need to do now is to drag the fields to the field areas that we would like so that we can summarize our data. Our first pivot table that we are creating, we are comparing to summarize data using SUMIFS, which we did in our previous videos. You can see this is the sum and this is the average. So we will use these same options, but we will summarize our data using the standard pivot tables. Let's drag the region field to the rows area of our pivot table. And you can see we have the rows area displays this category of field arranged in separate rows. The next thing that we need to do, we are counting the region. So we're doing the count of region. So any text values that I drag into the values area of our pivot table, that will default into count because that is text. Any number values that I drag into the values area of our pivot table, that will default into sum. We're dragging the region to the values area, and you can see by default, we are counting the region because the region field is a text value. Now we have our first standard pivot table created here, and we can see this shows as row labels instead of region. We will change that. But now this shows as count of region, and we can see it compares the same with this one. The only difference is that with formulas, if we add any data to our data set here or to our table, this will update automatically. But for the pivot table, we will have to refresh that, and I will show you that in a minute. First thing that we need to do here is to name our pivot table. So once you create a pivot table, you get two contextual tabs on your ribbon, the pivot table analyze and the design. To name our pivot table, we use the pivot table analyze tab. On the pivot table group, you select on the pivot table name box, and we will name this to reflect the data that we have on our pivot table. So this will be region count, and enter. Our pivot table is named. The next thing that we need to do is to change the report layout. We don't want it to be showing as row labels. So I will click on the design tab. This is where you will go to change the report layout. On the layout group, click on the report layout button arrow, and you select show in tabular. You can either choose show in outline or show in tabular, but I like using show in tabular form, and that is what we will use in this class. I will select show in tabular form, and now you can see now that changed from row labels to region. So if you do not want to change the report layout every time you create a pivot table, you can edit your default layout, and to do that, you go to the File tab and then scroll the way to the Options, select the Data, and then on the Data options, click on Edit Default Layout. And right here, you can see the report layout is showing in compact form. We will change that to show in tabular form. We'll click OK, and we will click OK. Now, moving forward, anytime we create or insert a pivot table, it will show the report layout in tabular form. So let's create or insert our second pivot table. So always make sure that you are in a cell inside your data set. And as I said, I'm using the keyboard shortcut, and this time I will do it slowly. Alt. And you can see right here when I press the Alt, we have the key on each of the tabs on our ribbon right there. For insert, it's N. So I'll press N. And then we are inserting a pivot table. You can see the tips right here showing you which key to press on your keyboard. And I'll press V. And now when I press V, it's now coming to the pivot table. And you can see from table range is T. So I'm pressing T. And you can see that again opened my pivot table from table range dialog box. And now let's create a pivot table. We need to choose a location, which is the next step, existing worksheet. And our location will be in cell L14, and you can see the location right there. We are not adding this data to the data model, so we'll just click OK. On this pivot table, we are summarizing the sum of revenue for each region. So again, we are dragging the region to the rows. And as you can see, because we changed the default layout for our report layout to show in tabular, now our pivot table is showing the region on our rows area right there. Now let's drag the revenue to the values area. And you can see by default, as I said, any number of values that you drag to the values field, it will default to sum. We are adding that, so that is correct. Next thing that we need to do is to name our pivot table. Don't forget that. You need to make sure that you're naming your reports. So as I always insist in this class, make sure that you're naming your workbook. Make sure that you're naming your worksheets. Make sure that you're naming your Excel tables. And make sure that you're naming your pivot tables. So let's name our pivot table. I'm in the pivot table analyze tab, pivot table group, and I will click on the pivot table names box. And I will name this regional sales and enter. So that is named. We don't have to change the report layout because we already changed that to default in show in tabular form. So the next thing that we need to do is to add number formatting to our pivot table. And to do that, you only select in one cell in your pivot table, and then you right click. This is the first option that I will show you, and I will show you different options in our next pivot table that we will create. And then you select number format. That opens the format cell dialog box. So you want the number, you want the currency, or you want the accounting, you can select whichever you want. So I will select currency, and I'm showing the decimal places as 2 digits, and I will click OK. And you can see that has formatted my values area on my pivot table, and it formatted all the numbers in my values area. Now let's create that pivot table. In that pivot table, we're doing the average of the revenue for each region. So again, click in any one cell in your proper data set or in your table, Alt N V T. This time I'm going fast because we already know the keyboard shortcut. And I'm creating my pivot table in an existing worksheet. And the location is L22. I'm not adding this to the data model, so I will not check that box. So I will click OK. And now we have that pivot table here. Again, we're dragging the region to the rows area. We're summarizing the average revenue for each region. So I'm dragging the revenue to the values area. And by default, it's sum. So there are different ways to edit the value field settings. And I will show you all the 4 different ways that we have to open the value field settings dialog box. So the first way, in the standard pivot table in the worksheet, double click on the calculation column header name to open the value field dialog box. And once we double click that, you see we open the value field settings dialog box. I like to call this a one-stop shopping center, where when you open the value field settings, you have different ways that you can edit your pivot table. You can name the custom name of your column header right here. You can change the name right there. You can summarize the values by, and you see we have different options. And if I scroll down, we have different options that you can use to summarize or to do your calculations and summarize values by. You also can use the show values by, which we'll look at that in our video number 8. We can also do the number formatting in the value field settings. So if I click on the number formatting, you see we do have an option to do the number formatting here as well. I will cancel that, and I will cancel that. That's one way. So I will show you the second way to do that. And the second way to open the value field settings dialog box is right here on the values area of your pivot table. If you click on that arrow, you do have an option from the drop down menu here to open the value field settings. And if I click on it, again it opens the value field settings dialog box. I will close that, and I will show you the third way. And the third way is to right click in any one cell in the values area of your standard pivot table in the worksheet and select the value field settings. So I will right click on that, and then from this drop down menu, select the value field settings, and you can see again we open the value field settings dialog box. Now the fourth way, while your pivot table is selected, so you are in the values area of your pivot table, and you can see right here on my ribbon, the pivot table analyze tool is active. I will click on that right there, and right here on the active field, we do have the field settings button. So if I click on that, again it opens the value field settings dialog box. And while I'm here, now I will change my calculation here to average. I will click on that. And once I do that, you see the custom name up here changes to average of revenue. I will also do my number formatting where I'm here. As I said, this is a one-stop shopping area. I will click on that. And I'm changing my number formatting to currency. I'm keeping the 2 decimal places. I'm keeping the symbol. I'm not changing how to show the negative numbers. And I will click OK. And I will click OK right here as well. And once I do that, you can see that has formatted my values. And we have changed our calculation to average revenue. Now we'll click to expand my column width right there so that I can see everything clearly right there. So the other thing that I said that I will show you is the difference between using the formulas and the pivot tables. So with the formulas, if we have this as an Excel table and we add more data to our table, the formulas will automatically update, but the pivot table, we will have to refresh that. And I'll show you that. Now we all remember how to convert our data set to an Excel table, and I will do that. I'm inside my table, my proper data set in one cell, and I'll use the keyboard shortcut Control-T. I'm converting this data set to an Excel table. My table has headers, you see that right there. And I will click OK. We'll click OK. And you can see now we have converted that to an Excel table. As always, the first thing that we need to do is to name our table. And I will name this monthly revenue and enter. Oh, that name already exists, so I should give it a different name. We cannot name a table with a name that already exists, so I will change that. I'll name this month rev and then STD for standard pivot table, and then I will enter. I'm sure I don't have that name, and we can see, yep, data grid, I don't have that name. So the next thing that I need to do is to add more data here, and then we will see how our sum ifs, the data that we are summarizing with the sum ifs updates, because these are formulas, but for the pivot table, we will have to refresh that. So I will scroll down. I have my data right there, Control C, and come up here to my Excel table right there, and I will press Control V on my keyboard. And once we do that, we can see our data here automatically updated. Now let's look at our pivot table. Our data here didn't update, so we'll need to refresh this. We have a keyboard shortcut if we need to refresh all the tables at the same time. And the keyboard shortcut to refresh all the tables at the same time is Control Alt F5. Now, if you're only refreshing one pivot table and you would like to use the keyboard shortcut, it's Alt F5. Now, if you do not like to use the keyboard shortcut, then make sure that you're inside your standard pivot table and then right click on it. And then from the drop down menu, you click on refresh. Now for us, we want to refresh all the pivot tables at the same time. And so we'll use the keyboard shortcut, Control Alt F5, and that refreshes all our pivot tables. Now I'm gonna expand these two columns because I do not like the way it's showing. Okay, now that looks better. So now you see the difference between using the formulas to summarize your data and using the standard pivot tables to summarize your data. The formulas, once you add more data, it updates automatically. But the standard pivot tables, you have to remember to refresh your pivot table. The reason why a standard pivot table does not update your data if you add more data to your data set, this is because when you create a standard pivot table, Excel creates a copy of the source data and stores that in the pivot cache. The pivot cache is stored in the Excel's memory. And that's why once you update the source of your data, or if the source of your data changes, it doesn't change your pivot table, but you always need to remember either to right click and click refresh to refresh your data, or use the keyboard shortcut to refresh your pivot tables. Now you can see the cached pivot data, but that's the data that the pivot table references when you build your pivot table, or when you change a slicer selection or move rows and columns around. When you group dates in a pivot table, which you will see in this video and in video number 8, when you group dates as well, the pivot cache is where the action takes place. So the pivot cache saves the action of grouping by dates so that when you use the date column in other places, the date column will remain grouped. Also, when you use a slicer or change the conditions and criteria in the pivot table, these actions are interacting with the pivot cache of your data and not the original source data. So keep in mind, if you change your data source or if you update your data source, you also need to refresh your pivot tables. You right click on your pivot table and you click refresh, or you use the keyboard shortcut Control Alt F5 if you have multiple pivot tables that you're refreshing, or Alt F5 if you're only refreshing one pivot table. Now let's go and look at Standard PivotTable Data Analysis worksheet. And in this worksheet, we will see the example of how the pivot table does the data analysis. We will create a pivot table that reports the monthly total revenue for each sales rep. We'll also create a pivot table that reports the monthly total revenue. We'll then add a slicer for the sales rep and a chart for the monthly revenue report to visualize our data. Let's create our first pivot table here. As I said, I always use the keyboard shortcut to insert a pivot table. I'm making sure that I have selected one cell inside my table, and I'll press Alt and VT, and I have the pivot table from table or range dialog box open. So I'm making sure that I can see the dancing ants on my data set on my table, and I can see the table range right there. I'm not creating the pivot table in a new worksheet. So I'll make sure that I select existing worksheet, And now my location box is active for me to select the location. I need to make sure that I leave empty cells all around my dataset. And so I'm clicking on cell G6. That's how I will create my pivot table, or this is where I will insert my pivot table. I'm not adding the data to the data model, so I will not check that box. I will click OK. Our goal for this standard pivot table is to create a pivot table that reports the monthly total revenue for each sales rep. We will drag the date field to the rows area so that we can get the month field. So when we drag the date to the rows area, the pivot table will group the date for us. So when we group the date in our pivot table, the PivotTable cache is where the action takes place. And as I said, the pivot cache saves the action of grouping by dates. So when we use the date column in other places, or when we create another pivot table using the same fields, the date column will remain grouped. So let's drag the date to the rows area, and we can see it groups that for us, the month, the days, and the date. Now, grouping is one of the most important features in a pivot table tool. It allows us to use the number values such as the dates and group them in categories like the month, the day, the date, and the quarter. This feature makes it easy to analyze transactions that are listed as dates. As you can see in our table right here, our transactions are listed as dates. It makes it easy to analyze the transactions listed as dates into months and year totals, and you can create the monthly or yearly sales report. And in our case, we are creating a monthly sales report. Now, this feature works well in a standard pivot table, but with a data model pivot table, it either does not work well or it doesn't work at all. Now, before I drag the fields that I do not want out of our rows area of our pivot table, I would like to show you, if you would like to expand these fields right here, you right click on one of the rows right there, and it opens the drop down menu right here. And you can see we have an option to expand and collapse. So if you would like to expand, you click expand. If you would like to expand the entire field, then you click expand the entire field. So if I click on there, it expands the entire field. Now, if you would like to collapse the day's date right here, I will right click on it, and then I will select expand collapse. And this time I will select collapse entire field. And you can see it collapses the field. So another thing that you can do here, you can right click again on any of these, and then you group or you ungroup. So if you group, you'll be grouping either by, so let's click on that. So if you're grouping, this is how it shows. So if we select one of these and we click OK, we can see now we get a quarter. If that's not what we want, we can ungroup that as well. So again, I will right click on my pivot table right there, and I will select group. And this time I don't want the quarters, so I will select on that to deselect it, and I will click OK, and now the quarter is gone as well. So I would also like to collapse that. So I will expand collapse and then collapse entire field. And now I'm back to the way I had it here originally. So if you would like to remove a field that you have created by dragging the dates to the rows area, you can drag that field out from your pivot table, or you can ungroup it as we have seen how to ungroup, and we deselected the quarter. So we can use the rows area, and I will click on the day's date right there. I will drag it out, and as I do that, you can see I have removed it from my rows area, and it's also not in my pivot table. The other way to do that, I'll do Control Z. So the other way to do that, right here on my fields area, I can see I have the days and the months selected. If I don't want to see that there, I can uncheck the day's date that I don't want to see there. I will uncheck that, and you can see it's gone as well. Now let's rename this to months so that it won't read months and date. So I'm clicking on it, I have selected on it, and I will just type months and enter. And now that is named as months, and you can see right here is also months, and right here is months as well. We renamed our calculation column header right there. So we are analyzing a report, or we are creating a report for monthly total revenue for each sales rep. So we need the revenue to the values area. So now that's the monthly revenue, but we all need to analyze each sales rep. So I will click on the sales rep field right there and drag it to the rows. And I see I don't like the way it's showing right there. So I will click on this field and drag it up on top of the months. And now I like the way I see it there. And that's why it's called a pivot table, because I can pivot around my fields into the areas that I want them, and even to move them around and change to show how I want to show my pivot table. So now that looks good. So the next thing that we need to do is to do the number formatting. And if you would like to style our pivot table, we can do that as well. And I will show you how to do it. So we remember how to do our number formatting. I'm selecting on any cell in the values area of my standard pivot table. I'm not selecting all of them, just one cell. I will right click on that. And then from my drop down menu, I will select number formatting. I'm selecting currency, so I will click on currency. I'm keeping the 2 decimal places, I'm keeping the symbol, and I'm not changing how the negative numbers show, so I will just click OK. We have done number formatting to our values right there. So up here, I don't need the sum revenue showing here with the dollar, so I will edit that. I can either double click on it or type on it. I will double click on that, and I will change from my one-stop shopping area right there, and I will click OK, and that has changed. The other thing that I would like to show you is if you would like to change the style, you click up here, so making sure that your standard pivot table is selected in any of the cell so that you can have the contextual tab showing right there. And I will click on the design tab on my ribbon. And right here on the pivot table styles, you can see that we have different styles. And if you click on that arrow, we do have different styles that we can choose from. So I will choose the light green pivot table light 21 and see how that looks like. And I like the way it looks like. If you would like to choose a different style, well and good, that is totally fine. So I would like this style to be on my data set right there. So I will come up here and select my headers right there. And I will change the color to match this color as well. So I will go to my font group and see if I can find a color that matches. Yep, I have a color that matches with that. So I have all that matching as well. I'm trying to make sure that I'm having all my data set and my pivot tables coordinated in one style or in one color. So we need to make sure that we name our pivot table. Do not forget that. So make sure your pivot table is selected in any one cell, and then go to the pivot table analyze tool on your ribbon. On the pivot table group, we need to rename this on the pivot table name box. So click on that and we will rename this. So we are naming this sales rep monthly revenue. So sales rep month rev. Press enter. Now that is named. So we're done with the first goal. The next thing that we need to do is to create another pivot table. The next pivot table, we are summarizing the monthly total revenue. We will add a slicer and then we will visualize our data with a chart. So I'm going back to my data set onto my table and making sure that I'm selecting just one cell in there, and I'm using my keyboard shortcut to insert a pivot table, Alt-N-V-T. I'm now inserting my pivot table in a new worksheet, but in this same worksheet. That means I have to select existing worksheet. I need to make sure that I'm leaving an empty cell as well. So I'm leaving this column blank there. and I'm clicking on cell K6. That's where I will place my pivot table. I'm not adding this data to the data model, so I'm not checking that box, and I will click OK. Now on this pivot table, we are creating a report for the monthly total revenue. Now, as I said earlier, we already grouped our date, and the action of grouping our date was saved in our pivot cache. So we have the month field from the grouping that we did when we were creating this pivot table. And all I will do right now is just drag the month field to the rows area. So I will drag that, and I have my month right there. I will change that from month, date to just month. So I will just type on there, months, and enter. And that is changed. And the next thing, we need to drag the total revenue to the values area because we need to calculate the total revenue. So I'm clicking on that, dragging it to the values area, and I have that now in our pivot table. So I need to rename this as well. I will double click on that calculation column header, and on the custom name, I will backspace to remove the dollar symbol and click OK. And the next thing that I need to do is to do the number formatting for my calculations right here. So I'm clicking on any one cell in the values area of my pivot table. Right click on it, select number formatting. I'm doing currency, and I'm not changing anything there. I click OK, and now that is formatted. The next thing that we need to make sure that we do is to name our pivot table. We're naming this pivot table monthly revenue. So my pivot table analyze tool on my ribbon tab is selected. Come to my pivot table group on the pivot table name box, and I will name this monthly revenue. Now that is named. I would like to change the style so it matches the style that I have here. So I will go to the design tab on my ribbon right there, and I will select the same style that I used for my first pivot table. And now that matches. The next thing that we need to do is to create a slicer for the sales rep for this pivot table. So I'm making sure that I am selecting the standard pivot table that I would like to create a slicer for. I'm not going back to my data set here, which is the original data source, but I'm analyzing my pivot table, and I'm creating a filter, which we know that a slicer acts like a filter. So we are creating a slicer to analyze our standard pivot table for the monthly revenue. So make sure that you click in any one cell of your standard pivot table, which is the monthly revenue pivot table. And we know that when we use a slicer or change the condition and the criteria in the pivot table, these actions are also interacting with our pivot cache data and not the original source data. And that's why I said we're not selecting any cell in this source data, but we are selecting a cell in our pivot table right there. So when I'm still here, now to insert a slicer, I will go to the pivot table analyze tool right there. And on the filter group, I can see that I have the insert slicer button. I can click on that slicer to insert a slicer. The other way that I can insert a slicer is to go to my insert tab on my ribbon. And right here on the filters group, I also have the slicer button, and I can click on that to insert a slicer. So we are inserting a sales rep slicer. So I will check that box to insert the slicer, and then click OK. And once I do that, we can see now we have our slicer right there, and I'm moving it so I place it somewhere right there next to our pivot table. Now, if you would like to change how many columns that you have in our slicer, you can do that. Up here on your ribbon, you can see now we have a slicer tab here, which is a contextual tab if we have a slicer and our slicer is selected. If I click outside the slicer, we don't see the slicer tab right there. If I want it to show, I have to click inside the slicer And now our contextual tab, the slicer tab, now shows right there. So as I was saying, if you would like to change the number of columns, right here on your buttons group, you can see the columns box right there. You can either type on it, or use these arrows to increase the number of columns. I'll keep it as one column. If you would like to change the style, which I will do because I want it to have a coordinated color or to match my pivot tables right here. So if you would like to change the style, still selecting on the slicer, and I can see on my ribbon when the slicer tab is selected there, I have the slicer styles right there. So I will click on that arrow to reveal more, and I will see if that matches with my color, and I see it does. So I have a coordinated color right there. Now I would like to resize that, and I'm dragging this up to resize it, and now that looks good. So the next thing that we need to do here to accomplish our goal is to create a chart to visualize our monthly revenue report. So we are visualizing this pivot table with a chart. We use PivotCharts to visualize the summarized data in the pivot table, and this allows us to see patterns and the trends on your data. The pivot table and the pivot charts will enable you to make informed decisions about the data being summarized. There's two ways that we can use to insert or create a pivot chart. And the first way to do that is to go to the Insert tab on your ribbon, and on the Charts group, you will see the Pivot Chart button. Click on that arrow and then select the pivot chart to insert a pivot chart. I will cancel that, and I will show you the next way to insert a pivot chart. While you're still inside the pivot table that you would like to analyze, you click on the pivot table Analyze on your ribbon, and then on the Tools group, you click on the Pivot Chart button, and I'll click on that. And here we have our Insert Chart dialog box open. We have different charts that we can use. We will use the line chart, and I will select the line chart there. And we are using the first option right there, which is the line chart. And I will click OK. And now we have the line chart, which is our pivot chart inserted here. And we can see, as I said, with the pivot chart, we are able to see the patterns and the trends on our data. Now we need to make changes to our pivot chart and remove any junk data. As you can recall from our Excel Basics video number 2, we learned how to format our charts. The first thing that we need to do is to remove any junk data, and I will remove these two fields as we do not need them. So I will right click on that, and I will select Hide All Field Buttons on the chart. And now that is hidden. The next thing that we need to do, we need to remove this, since we already know that this is the total revenue. So I will delete that once I see the solid line selected on that. I will delete that. And I will drag the pivot table fields to this side so that it will not block me, and so that you can see what I'm doing here. The next thing that we need to do is to change the chart title right there. So what I will do, I will use a cell reference for our chart title, and I will drag this a little bit down so I can create our chart title right here. So I will type here the chart title. So we have our chart title there. So what we will do here, we will use a cell reference. So once the chart title is selected and you see a solid line, type equals, and on the formula bar, you can see the equals sign right there, even though we don't see it here. And then I will use a cell reference for the chart title that I just created. And you can see the dancing ants here showing that we're using this as a cell reference. And I will enter. And we can see now we have changed our chart title for our pivot chart. If you would like to add data labels to this, you can click on the chart elements button right there. And then if you would like to add data labels, you select that, and you can see once I hover on it, I see the data labels at the top. And if I click there, use that arrow, it is above our line, and it doesn't look neat. It looks like junk. So I will unselect that. I will not add data labels. If you would like to change the style, you click on this chart styles button right there, and you're able to change the styles from there. I'm not changing the style, and so I will escape that. I will keep the guidelines as they are giving us a guidance to see how much is the revenue for each month right here. Because when we added our data labels here, it looked like it was too much junk and it was very hard to read. So I will keep the vertical axis there, and I will keep the guidelines there. And you can see our pivot chart looks good. If you would like to make more edits on your pivot chart, make sure you do, and make sure by the time you're done editing it and formatting it, that you have a pivot chart that looks good and presentable. So that's our pivot chart. We have our chart title right there, and I can bold this. So Control B to bold that. And if you do not like the chart title showing here, you can drag your pivot chart right there and cover it there. And now that is covered. If you're okay with it showing, you can drag it back and keep the chart title right there showing. So I will leave it that way, and I will click outside that. And you can see in this worksheet, we did some data analysis. We have the first pivot table where we are analyzing the monthly total revenue for each sales rep. We have the second pivot table where we are analyzing the monthly total revenue. We are adding a slicer to that, and we are also visualizing that using the pivot chart. Now, if I click on any of these sales rep and filter that to see how that works, if I click on the first sales rep there, you can see it's filtering the sales for just to show only the sales for Carmen. And you can see it's the same here on our pivot chart. If I hold down the control key and select another sales rep right there, you can see same thing. Our criteria is these two sales rep, and our data here is filtering to show the criteria that we selected. If also you would like to select multiple sales rep, you can click on the multi-select, and then you click on the sales rep that you would like to select. And now you can see once we added the third sales rep there, our data is also changing to update to the criteria that we are specifying here. Now to clear your filters, you use this button right there, and if I click on it, we have cleared our filters, and now we are showing the sales for all the sales rep. Now let's go to our third example on this video, which is the standard cross-tabulated pivot table. And I will click on the standard cross-tabulated pivot table worksheet. This is our example number 3 in this video. And in this worksheet, we will create a cross-tabulated pivot table. Our goal here, we are creating a cross-tabulated pivot table that reports the total revenue by product and the region. And then we will add a slicer for the sales rep. Now this data, if I use my control down arrow key, we can see it's about 1,000 rows. I will use my control up arrow key to go back to the top of my data set right there. Now note this is only 1,000 rows as we have seen. We can have about 50,000 rows for a standard pivot table, but for a data that is more than 50,000 rows, I will recommend that you use data model pivot table. Now here we are creating a cross-tabulated pivot table, and I'm making sure that I have selected any one cell inside my dataset right there, and I'll use my keyboard shortcut Alt+N+V+T. I'm creating a pivot table in this existing worksheet, so I will select the existing worksheet right there, and the location box right now is active for me to select the location. And I'm selecting in cell G10. That's where I will place my pivot table. I'm not adding this data to the data model, so I'm not checking that box. I will click OK. I have my pivot table inserted there. The next thing is to drag the fields to the areas below here. I want the product and the region. So if I drag the region to the rows and the product to the columns, because this is a cross-tabulated pivot table, so one field has to go to the rows and the other field has to go to the columns. And then the field that we are calculating will go to the values area. Now that doesn't look good, but because this is a pivot table, I'm allowed to pivot and see which one I like better. I'm changing the region to the columns and the products to the rows, and that looks good to me. And now I will get the revenue to the values because I would like to calculate the total of revenue. And I can see now I have my cross-tabulated pivot table. Now with the cross-tabulated pivot table, if I click on this cell, that means these total sales are for the North region and for the LOL surprise product only. If I click in this cell right there, so these sales are for the Northwest region and the product is LOL OMG surprise. Now I would like to add number formatting to my pivot table. So while I'm still inside my pivot table in the values area, I will right click that and select number format. And I'm using the currency number format right there. I'm keeping the 2 decimal places and I will click OK. The next thing that I would like to do is to name our pivot table. And I will go to Pivot Table Analyze tab, the Pivot Table group, and on the Pivot Table name box. And I will name this regional revenue. So regional rev and enter. And now I would like to add a slicer for the sales rep. And again, as we have seen in this video in our other pivot tables that we created, I have to make sure that I'm inside the pivot table before I add the slicer. So I'm inside the pivot table right there, and I will use the Pivot Table Analyze tab on my ribbon. On the filter group, I will select Insert Slicer, and I'm inserting a slicer for the sales rep. So I'm clicking on the sales rep checkbox right there. Click OK, and I have my sales rep slicer right there. I will drag it up there. And now I would like to change the columns to 5 instead of 1. I can either use this arrow right there or I can type there 5 and enter. And I will adjust my slicer here to show all the sales rep. Now with this slicer, it's filtering our data right there. So if I click on Tiana, I can see now these total sales are only for Tiana. And if I click on a specific region, for example, I click on the Northwest, I can see the sales for Northwest for Tiana and the product is Hot Wheels is 23,373.30 cents. So if you would like to filter multiple sales rep, you can do that. You can use your control key and select on the sales rep that you would like to filter, or you can use this button right there to multi-select the sales rep that you would like to filter. I will clear my filters. And the other thing that I would like to do is to coordinate my color. So I will change the style for the pivot table and I will change the style for the slicer. Now I'm still in my pivot table, so I will go to the design tab and I will change the style. I will choose that style right there. And I see that coordinates with that color. Now I will click on my slicer, go to the slicer tab, on the slicer styles, and I will use that style right there. And I see now my color is coordinating and it looks good. You can use the style of your choice. You're welcome to do that. And with that, we have come to the end of this video where we have learned a lot of good skills. In this video, we have learned how to summarize our reports using standard pivot tables and add slices. We have also seen how to use the pivot charts to visualize the summarized data in the pivot table. In this video, I have included some homework files. We have 4 homework files in this video, and you can download this workbook at the end of this video, just below the link for this video, and you can practice working on these homeworks to give you more practice on what we have learned in this video. In our next class video, we'll continue to learn on pivot table reports, and we will learn how to summarize values by and show values as in our standard pivot table reports. Thank you, and I will see you in our next video. Bye for now.